Okay, Caine, thank you very, very much for joining me for yet another deep dive.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I'm good. Thanks for inviting me on your first ever Christmas special. Let's hope it's the first of many.
I hope so. I hope so. And you've been looking into the traditions of Christmas a great deal. We've been talking about this quite a lot, haven't we, together?
Yeah, well, it's actually something. I mean, I've always enjoyed Christmas. I'm a unashamedly big Christmas fan. You know, a lot of people, I think, they do the whole bar humbug thing, and I think sometimes people get the idea that it's maybe, I don't know, cool's the wrong word, but you know, it's good to go against the grain and say, oh, I can't stand the holiday season and blah blah blah. I'm definitely the opposite. I love Christmas. I think it's great. I think it's a great time of year. It's a brilliant holiday. Definitely my favorite. And since I came to China and started teaching English, I of course had to teach classes on Christmas, and it was teaching those classes that led me to doing a lot more in-depth research than I probably would have ever done had I not been required to teach about the holiday and the history. And so, yeah, 9 years of teaching about the holiday has been a really interesting experience, because each year I like to kind of revamp my lesson plan. And as a result, I'll do, you know, more reading and more research. So I'm by no means an expert, but I'm probably a pretty well-informed amateur when it comes to the sort of history and culture of Christmas, at least in the British Isles.
And it's interesting. A lot of listeners may be surprised that in China, there really isn't a Christmas.
Yeah, we touched on this before in the episode where we talked about being a British person living abroad. And there are still countries in the world where Christmas is, you know, relatively unknown. I mean, it's not unknown in China. That's not true, but it's certainly not celebrated outside of some Christian communities. Actually, the biggest celebrations you'll probably find will be in training schools, in private language schools, because they have non-Chinese teachers and they make a big thing of celebrating the holiday for the kids. But it's very much on the sort of superficial level. There's not a great deal put into the kind of history and culture behind Christmas. So yeah, it's something that I've been teaching and myself researching and learning about for quite some time now. So I'm certainly interested to share it for the first time, to share my knowledge, albeit amateur knowledge, of the history and culture of Christmas with English speakers, or, you know, people who are listening to this podcast, rather than students learning English.
And it's interesting. I mean, in my experience, you know, I lived in China less than you, but just for 6 years. And often Chinese co-workers would message me just after midnight, Christmas Eve, and say Merry Christmas, because they saw it as our New Year.
Yeah, we mentioned that, didn't we, in the last podcast? Not the last podcast, sorry, but one of the podcasts that we did together. And yeah, there's a lot of misunderstanding is maybe the wrong word, but not all of the traditions that we're familiar with have made it to China, and they've kind of reinterpreted some of it, which again, I don't actually have a problem with. I think, you know, well, I don't think, I know to be true, that Christmas is a world holiday. It doesn't belong to any one culture or one society. And actually, I think many people outside the UK, or perhaps outside you know, the English-speaking world, would be surprised at how much diversity there is in the celebration of Christmas. But in relation to the podcast that we're doing today, if you are in, you know, the Anglosphere, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the US, and so on, and more generally, if you're sort of in the Western world when you're listening to this, there's a solid chance that a lot of your ideas about Christmas and the ways in which you celebrate Christmas have their roots in the British Isles. It's one of those things that, particularly during the Victorian period, which I'll talk about later, hopefully, really spread, you know, from the UK outwards to the rest of the world, so that much of what people just sort of take for granted as being the way to celebrate Christmas, without ever sort of thinking, well, how did that come to be? It actually originated in the UK. So yeah, I thought that would be something that would be interesting for listeners who aren't in the UK to listen to sort of see where these celebrations come from.
Absolutely. And as I say, I'm looking forward to this conversation. I have been looking forward to it for quite a while.
Yeah, well, when we started talking about this, I was a little bit unsure about how to approach it. And I thought the best way to go about it would maybe be to give a brief but hopefully comprehensive history of Christmas in the British Isles, and then move on to talk about some of the well-known Christmas celebrations that are popular almost all over the world, but have their origins in the UK. And then I thought we could end by talking about some of the quite unique celebrations, which are still today really only popular in the UK and are not well known even in other English-speaking countries like the US and Canada.
Sounds like a plan. So we start at the beginning.
Yeah, and the beginning is actually going to be the Middle Ages, which may surprise some of your viewers. I keep saying viewers, sorry, whenever we do these, whenever we do these things, your listeners, because I think a lot of people, they think about the history of Christmas and they have the impression that basically Christmas was a kind of Christian rebranding of much more ancient pagan midwinter celebrations. And it's certainly true that in the British Isles, before Christianity, there were celebrations, midwinter celebrations. In fact, all over the world, it seems there's something, I don't know, there's something about the winter time that means that across cultures, people have found themselves wanting to have some sort of celebration in the middle of winter, to perhaps just to get themselves through the darkest and coldest days. I mean, we see this in China with the Dongjie Festival, which is the celebration of the winter solstice. And many other cultures around the world have these midwinter celebrations. And those definitely did exist in the UK for, since time immemorial. But whilst there may be some of the traditions from those very ancient pagan festivals which have influenced some of the modern Christmas celebrations, the idea that Christmas is just a sort of appropriation of earlier pagan festivals, I don't think is particularly accurate. It's something that many, if you search on the internet for history of Christmas, it's something that you'll find quite common. You might see YouTube videos or see blogs about, oh, it was just these old pagan winter festivals, and that's why we have, this, that, and the other. But from my research, which admittedly is very amateur, I'm not a trained historian or anything like that, to me, it doesn't seem like there is a kind of direct line between these early pagan festivals and, the celebration of Christmas. And although I'm certainly not a trained historian and I'm just, an amateur at all of this, most of what I'm reading or a lot of what I'm reading is from quite reliable sources. And it certainly seems to me that amongst academic historians, the idea that Christmas is just a sort of rebranding or an appropriation of earlier pagan festivals is not a commonly held view. So that's why I'm starting at the Middle Ages, because it would be very interesting to do a podcast about those pre-Christian pagan celebrations, and perhaps one day we can, but that's not the podcast we're doing today, right? The podcast we're doing today is about the history of Christmas, and that, as far as I can tell, in the British Isles, really begins in the sort of post-pagan era. And although, like I said, may have some relationship, some of the customs and traditions may have some relationship to earlier pagan traditions, they're not one and the same. And being as we're talking about Christmas, I think that's where we need to begin our history.
I agree. And it's a common thing of debunking Christmas, but I'm quite like the idea where maybe we're debunking the debunking Christmas people.
Yeah, that exactly. Yeah, we did speak about that. There's this whole subcategory of content online dedicated to debunking, and unfortunately, a lot of it, it's not really correct. And in this desperate attempt to prove people's established ideas wrong, I think people often jump to the wrong conclusions. In fact, I was watching a fantastic video. This is only a slight tangent. It's quite related. So I promise I won't stay on it too long, but it is related. There's a brilliant YouTube channel called Religion for Breakfast. I'd highly recommend it to any of your listeners. In fact, perhaps you can leave a link to this specific video in the notes for the podcast so that your listeners can quite easily find the video I'm talking about. And the channel is been created by a guy who has a PhD in religious studies, and his area of specialism is Christianity in the Roman Empire. So I think it's fair to say he's pretty much an expert on this subject. And he made a video about this idea that the reason that Christmas is on the 25th of December is because that it was a rebranding of Roman pagan festivals, in particular the Saturnalia. How do you say it? Saturnalia? Yeah, I think that's right. And the birthday of Sol Invictus. So again, this is a common thing if you Google why is Christmas on the 25th, because of course in the Bible it doesn't say when Jesus was born, right? It doesn't say the date on which he was born. So if you Google why is it the 25th, common answers you'll find is that, it was just a rebranding of these Roman pagan holidays. And in the video, he discusses that idea and says that, there is perhaps some elements of truth in that, the sense that there were these popular festivals that were happening about the same time, and they were happening as the Roman Empire was converting to Christianity. But he points out that this theory of the reason why the date is the 25th, it certainly doesn't tell the whole story. And doesn't account for many other things that were happening. So, for example, he points out that only half of the Roman Empire celebrated Christmas on the 25th of December. The other half, the Eastern Roman Empire, celebrated it on the 6th of January. And on the 6th of January, there is no birthday of Sol Invictus and there's no Saturnalia. So if it was simply a rebranding of these pagan festivals, why did the rebranding only happen in one half of the empire? Another thing he points out is that the theory fails to take into account the weakness of the church authorities at that period. We perhaps think today of the Roman Catholic Church authorities and how they have sort of absolute say over what happens in the church. Well, that wasn't the case in the early days of the church. The bishops and the church authorities really had very little influence over the way people worshipped and how they celebrated outside of their immediate congregation. The idea that they could just say to people, okay, stop celebrating this, start celebrating that, is quite absurd, really. Also, it doesn't take into account the fact that there are other conflicting theories as to why the date was chosen, such as the calculation theory. So it's generally believed by many Christian theologians that Mary became pregnant with Jesus on the 25th of March. And being as, a human baby usually takes 9 months to gestate, that would mean that the birth of Jesus would be the 25th of December. So anyway, in the video, he points out that this idea, again, this is one of those debunking things. Oh, you think Christmas is celebrated because of Christianity? Actually, it's because of these pagan festivals. Actually, whilst it may be the case that the other pagan festivals that were happening at the same time may have influenced in some way the choice of date, the idea that it was simply an appropriation of the pagan festivals, or it was simply chosen to make the best of a celebration that was already ongoing, really doesn't hold water once it's subjected to kind of academic scrutiny.
That is really interesting. It's often really tempting to believe that we live in very, very complex times and the past is super simple. And the reality is probably pretty complex back then. That's something these videos don't always take into account.
Exactly. I think when you're looking for information on history and culture, as the listeners of this podcast obviously are, that's why they're listening, it's very easy to kind of be attracted to simple answers. But the answer is, like you said, life was as complicated in the past as it is today, perhaps even more so in some periods, right? So the idea that we can simply sort of attribute something like the date on which Christmas is celebrated to something as simple as, oh, it was the birthday of Sol Invictus, so the church authorities appropriated it. No, it doesn't really happen that. We're talking of things that evolved over often, not just decades, but even hundreds of years across many different places in different environments, different political, cultural, social, linguistic environments, until we finally reach the stage we're at today. So, and that's back to what I was saying. That's what I sort of discovered when I started reading into the history of Christmas in the British Isles, is that whilst you'll find a lot of references to pre-Christian traditions, it really seems to me that if we're talking about Christmas as a festival, then we really have to start with the Christianization of the British Isles. And in fact, later than that, of course, because we don't know exactly when Christmas began to be celebrated in the British Isles. But the first recorded use of the word Christmas is from a book in 1038. So it's quite late. Of course, the British Isles would have been Christianized when the Roman Empire was Christianized, right? It was probably almost certainly celebrated, in fact, long before then. But that's the first time we have a reference to it, is in a book in 1038. So anyway, let's get into these celebrations then in the Middle Ages. So the first thing I think that's really interesting about this is that today, of course, we know Christmas being the most important celebration of the year. I think that's true whether you're Christian or atheist or anything in between. If you live in the UK, Christmas is going to be the most important celebration of the year for you. There'll be exceptions to this, for example, if you're Muslim. But generally speaking, and even if you are Muslim, you'd certainly agree that it's the most important celebration in the UK as a whole, right? Well, this wasn't.
I've got many Muslim friends, and they love Christmas. They love the stuff.
Yeah. Well, of course, because today it's a very secularized holiday, right? And it's a holiday that people of all religions can celebrate. I mean, that's one of the reasons why it's become so popular worldwide. But yeah, so in the Middle Ages, Christmas was just one of many celebrations and one of many feast days. Remember, this is a time when life is really dominated by the church calendar. And the traditional church calendar, has a lot of different saint days and feast days and so on and so forth. And Christmas was just one of those. It wouldn't have been at that time particularly more important than many of the other big celebrations that were happening throughout the year. In fact, I found references to the 15th century where it says that actually St. George's Day was considerably more popular and a bigger feast day than Christmas was. So, that's the kind of context that we have to view this in, that this is a time when people really organize their life around these festivals. It's that, okay, we work extremely hard until a certain date, and then we get to have a day off and we get to eat lots of food and get drunk. And, Christmas was one of those days.
I'm really interested in that. You say that, St. George's Day had been in some parts, the more popular holiday. And I certainly in the modern day, I think I've been in England on St. George's Day, kind of not really aware of what day it was. So it's interesting how they've swapped places, perhaps, or
certainly there's been a huge decline. Definitely, there's been a huge decline in the popularity of St. George's Day. And again, that's perhaps an interesting topic we can cover in another one, because it certainly is how that was really such a big, important celebration. It's essentially non-existent in most parts of England these days, right?
Yeah, and we of course put huge importance in Christmas Day, so it's really interesting that it didn't used to be so important, and now
it's become much more, right? It started to become more important as well, interestingly, because it became associated with the royal family, and in particular, there were a number of coronations done on Christmas Day. So Christmas Day became also, the anniversary of a king's reign. Actually, the first monarch that we know that did this wasn't a British ruler. It was Emperor Charlemagne, who was crowned the first Holy Roman Emperor on Christmas Day in 1800. So the first British is maybe the wrong word, but the first king in the British Isles to be crowned on Christmas Day was King Edmund of East Anglia. So for listeners who don't know where East Anglia is, it still exists. It's still a region of the UK. It's, as the name suggests, in the east of the country. It's that sort of sticky out part above London, if you imagine a map. It's where Norwich is. And there was a time when that was actually an Anglo-Saxon kingdom in and of itself. And King Edmund, who was the king of that kingdom, was crowned on Christmas Day in 1855.
That's really, really interesting. I didn't know that.
You lived for a short period in East Anglia, didn't you?
That's right. Yeah, I lived in Suffolk, so the southern part of East Anglia. As you say, it's a kind of a short drive from London. I guess it's London's countryside in some ways. Flat, beautiful, rich farming land. So when you needed large numbers of people to farm the land, it was one of the most populous parts of the UK. And of course, since the agricultural revolution, people have moved away, and it's now one of the most sparsely populated parts of the UK.
Yeah, it's a very sleepy part of the country, isn't it?
It is.
A lot of retired people live there.
Yeah, and farmers. So yeah.
And the most famous Christmas coronation was William the Conqueror, who was crowned King of England on Christmas Day in 1066. And as you can imagine, he, wanting to establish himself as the rightful ruler of the country, would make quite a big deal out of, his coronation days.
Yeah, absolutely. So we even start from William the Conqueror, the famous one.
yeah, the famous one. 1066 and all that. And also as well, there developed a tradition amongst English kings of having crown-wearing ceremonies on Christmas Day. So this didn't only happen on Christmas Day, it happened on some other feast days as well. But certainly by the mid-15th century, these formal crown-wearing ceremonies took place every year at Christmas. So I think it was that sort of intervention from royalty and the association of Christmas Day with a day to kind of honor the monarch perhaps helped to increase its popularity and make it stand out from the other various feasts and festivals that were happening throughout the year.
That's really interesting. I think when we were talking about our clothing episode, deep dive into British men's wardrobes, we're talking about how sometimes these things start at the top and then slowly trickle down. So here's the very top. It's the king or queen.
Yeah, certainly. And I think with Christmas, that does seem to be a theme running throughout how these celebrations are done. There seems to be some influence in certain aspects and certain traditions with what you might call the common people, but a lot of it does seem to be the trend was set by the royal family and the aristocracy, and then everybody else kind of followed suit. And I mean, that sort of makes sense. We're talking here about a celebration, right? And religious observances. You think about the masses of peasant farmers who just spend their days working from dusk till dawn. They don't really have the time to kind of create and recreate traditions and celebrations, right? They're not really in the sort of position to do that, whereas the royal family, with a lot more leisure time and a lot more means to, spend money on interesting clothes or food, can kind of create those customs and traditions.
That is really, really interesting. So when would you say that Christmas is becoming, I'd say, the dominant festival in the year?
Well, it ebbs and flows, actually. So I mean, well, sticking with where we were in the sort of, up until the kind of from 1066 onwards, the celebrations do start to become more popular, as we said, when it becomes associated with the royal family. And an interesting thing is the way that Christmas was celebrated then is very, very different to how it's celebrated today. One of the biggest differences is that there was actually fasting for Advent. So Advent, of course, begins the fourth Sunday before Christmas. So that's between the 27th of November and the 3rd of December. That's when Advent would start, and it ends on Christmas Eve. So today we, of course, think of this as the Christmas period, right? And that's when, people start eating their Advent calendars, and they go to work Christmas parties, and they allow themselves an extra glass of wine and a bit more food. So it's a kind of period of being quite gluttonous, right? But in the Middle Ages, it was a very austere period. That was when, you would fast that entire period. Now, we don't know exactly how the fasting was done, and it very likely varied, depending on the time and the place. It could have been fasting for just 3 days a week. It may have been fasting for 6 days a week in some places. Unlikely to be a strict fast where you'd have no food at all throughout the day. It's more likely to have been perhaps just one meal on fast days and no meat, eggs, or dairy products. So, it's different from the kind of fasting, say, that Muslims do for Ramadan. Where they don't have any food or water during the daylight hours. It was less strict than that kind of fasting, but nevertheless, quite strict, particularly for sort of more affluent people who would have been used to eating quite well every day.
It sounds a lot more like how we think about Lent.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's just like Lent. And of course, fasting was much more popular in the, I want to say olden days. That's not really the right word, but within the church generally, fasting was a lot more popular in the past than it used to be today. Although I have heard there's a bit of a resurgence actually, and a lot of not a lot perhaps, but some Christians are kind of rediscovering fasting and taking it up as a kind of spiritual discipline. But yeah, certainly it was a huge part of life in the Middle Ages. And again, this would have just been one of a number of different fast periods, such as Lent that you mentioned, and other fast days throughout the year.
That is interesting. So there's that preparation time, and there are sort of Advent services that we now get, sort of the 4 Sundays leading up to Christmas. But again, carrying through that week, I think there's a lot of people who like that.
Yeah, and I mean, there are some who sort of cynically think maybe the fasting was done just to save up food for Christmas, because you're not eating any eggs, not eating any cheese or butter, you're not eating any meats, which I suppose could have been the case. And maybe it did serve a sort of dual function for people who didn't have, a great deal of food. But I don't know. I imagine there was also the religious reasons involved as well. And then the Christmas celebration started on Christmas Day, and Christmas Day actually marked the beginning, not the end of the Christmas period. So we think of today really the beginning of the Christmas period. I mean, it changes on where you are in the world and who you ask, but generally it's about the beginning of December, right? That's when people start to put their decorations up and start to celebrate. And then really once you get to Christmas Day, there's maybe a few days after to relax, then it's New Year's Eve, and then that's it, you're done. Whereas actually in the Middle Ages, Christmas Day was the beginning of the Christmas period. And the Christmas period was 12 days long. That's where we get the song, the 12 Days of Christmas, right? On the first day of Christmas, bum, 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 you know the song. Yeah, so that's referring to the 12 celebration days of Christmas period.
And worth getting into that, because that's supposedly when the Magi arrived and saw Jesus. So it's from his birth.
Yeah, so it would end. Yeah, it would end when the 3 wise men were supposed to have came and visited Jesus. That was why that period was that long.
Yeah, and I know we said at the beginning, maybe we don't have time, but that's a major difference between what we call the Anglosphere and the European continent, right? So in Spain, the coming of the Three Kings is a major, major festival. We just don't have that in the UK.
Yeah, and well, interestingly, we kind of did, right? That was our original Christmas celebrations. They followed that same pattern because the biggest celebration day of the 12 days of Christmas wasn't Christmas Day. Now, there were a number of, I mean, the whole period would have been a festive period, right? It was all a festive period, and you would have been enjoying yourself and so on and so forth. But there were a number of feast days within that festive period. So you had Saint Stephen's Day on the 26th and Saint Sylvester's Day on the 31st of December. But the really big day, the day that today would be more similar to how we celebrate Christmas Day. That was the 12th night, which your listeners have maybe heard of as the Shakespeare play, the 12th night, which interestingly enough isn't anything to do with with that celebration. It was apparently the first
carried on, right? So we have the song and we have the play, but we've kind of the festival itself
lost the
has
tradition,
slowly faded away.
Well, apparently the play was originally written to be performed during the Christmas period, and possibly specifically on the 12th night, and that's why it may have been named the 12th night. Because the play itself, of course, isn't about the 12th night. Although it is a very good play, one of my favourite Shakespeare plays.
Yeah, it's one of the most fun plays.
Yeah, there's a great adaptation, and I can't for the life of me remember who did it or even any of the actors in it, but it sets the play in the Habsburg Empire. It was in the 1990s, I think it came out, or maybe early 2000s. No, I guess no, it would have been 1990s. It's a really, really good adaptation of Twelfth Night. Anyway, it's not important. But yeah, so the 12th night was the really big celebration, and this was a huge party, and it wasn't how we sort of think of a Christmas celebration where you get together with your family and you eat some food and maybe drink some wine. It was much more like a kind of a giant party, depending on your social class and your means. It would have either been your sort of extended family, maybe the whole village together. If you were part of the aristocracy, it would have been everyone who was sort of part of your household, along with all of the other people that you may have known, and so on. So it would have been a really, really big celebration, a big party, lots of drinking, lots of eating, just excessively, and a lot of game playing, and not Monopoly or charades, but rather more interesting games. Let's say there's one of the games that I came across, which I think is perhaps the most interesting to talk about, is a game which it actually remained popular from the Middle Ages right up until the Georgian era, and it's a game called Hot Cockles. I'm not sure why that was the name chosen, but I'll explain to you how the game is played anyway. So the game is played by one person has their head pushed into the lap of another person, which sort of makes them blindfolded in a sense. They can't see what's going on behind them, right? And this could be a man with his head pushed into the lap of another man, or a woman and a woman, or it could also be a man having his head pushed in the lap of a woman. And in fact, I've seen period illustrations of this game where it shows women lifting up their skirts so that men can really get their head very snugly into the lap of the woman.
I'm
and
on
then when
board
they're in,
so far.
yeah, and then when they're in this sort of starting position, I suppose you'd call it, the person who's face down, they then have to get hit on the behind. It could be a slap. Again, the game was likely played in different ways in different places. So I've seen it detailed as being a slap on the rear end. It could also be a kick, and basically the person being hit had to guess who was hitting them, and if they guessed correctly, then they would swap positions, and the person who did the hitting would become the hit-e. So these are the kind of games, and you can imagine this being played with a lot of people very drunk. This is not a sort of family friendly event. This is quite debauched. That's the sort of celebration that we're talking about here.
Sounds perfectly Christmassy to me.
Yeah, it's not the kind of thing you normally associate with Christmas, but that's sort of what the 12th night was like. It was this very, really rowdy kind of party atmosphere. And it continued, and these traditions continued to develop. And the 12th night celebrations seem to have reached their sort of height and importance. So you said, when did it become more and less important? So it seemed that Christmas and the 12th night celebrations really reached their height in the Tudor period. It's from this period we learn about a tradition known as the Lord of Misrule, or called in Scotland, I think more interestingly, the Abbot of Unreason. I like that. I think that sounds better than the Lord of Misrule.
I'm curious. I've never heard really
The
curious.
Lord of Misrule, or the Abbot of Unreason, is somebody who is appointed to be the sort of ruler and leader of the 12th night celebrations. So this person becomes, the king for the night, essentially, and his word is law, and anything he says other people must do. And his sort of job is to ensure that everybody gets exceptionally drunk and has a lot of fun and does a lot of stupid, silly things. There's different customs and celebrations. There's some reports of the Lord of Misrule having to dress up in very silly clothes, although that doesn't seem to have been that common. And the way the Lord of Misrule, or the Abbot of Unreason, was chosen was by lot. So they weren't elected. It was based on luck, essentially. Well, not essentially, actually based on luck. And again, there was probably different ways of doing this, but the most famous was that either a bean or a pea or sometimes a coin was baked into a 12th night cake. And a 12th night cake was a huge cake which had like dried fruit in it, and what at the time would have been quite expensive imported spices and things like that. And when you were eating the cake, whoever found the coin or the bean would be the Lord of Misrule or the Abbot of Unreason, and have to ensure that everybody has a very good time.
It sounds a little bit, two things. The pudding sounds a bit like the Christmas pudding, getting the coin in it.
Yeah.
And it also sounds like a stag party in which you might have one person organizing whatever's going on.
Yeah, definitely. I think, the second one is actually a really interesting point. I didn't think about that, but you're right. A stag party for the North American listeners is a bachelor party, right? That's what.
Yeah.
Yeah. And yeah, you're right. It does sound like a stag party where you have like the one guy who's sort of the most outgoing, the most sort of party animal, and he's in charge of, organizing everything. Yeah, it sounds very similar to that. And you're right. I certainly think that the modern tradition we have of Christmas puddings, and unfortunately we probably won't have time to talk about British Christmas food, but a Christmas pudding, which is this extremely stodgy fruit cake, is usually baked with a coin inside it, right? And if you find the coin, what's the tradition if you find the coin in a Christmas pudding? You're just the winner, aren't you? You're just lucky.
Yeah, I think you just get good luck. I'll try and make sure to put pictures on my Instagram so people can go there and have a look at what is Christmas pudding. I think setting fire to it is probably the main thing for me.
Yeah, setting fire to it. Yeah, of course, is it's covered in brandy butter, which is gorgeous, by the way, brandy butter. And then you set fire to it. So that's sort of the height of Christmas, really. At least that version of Christmas. The version of Christmas where it's celebrated over 12 days and the 12th night is this huge crazy party. The height of that seems to be the Tudor period. And then we have, of course, in the 1600s, huge turmoil with the English Civil War, and this big division within the Church of England between the Low Church and the High Church. And between the 1640s and 1660, a series of laws are passed which essentially bans the celebration of Christmas in England and Scotland and Wales, of course.
Yeah, and this is really the Puritans literally banning Christmas.
Yeah, I mean, they never sort of released a law which said Christmas is banned, and of course people would have still celebrated it in private. This is a time, we spoke about this before, when we talk about historical laws being passed and things being banned, we have to remember we're talking about a time when there was no police force and where many people would go their entire life without seeing an agent of the state. So it was, the idea that suddenly there was no Christmas isn't really true. But yeah, they passed a number of laws which basically made public celebrations of Christmas illegal, and untenable. You couldn't do it. So laws requiring, for example, shops and businesses to stay open on Christmas Day, a law which set Christmas Day as a fast day, and things like this, so that you couldn't really celebrate Christmas. Interestingly, this wasn't just accepted by the general public. There was actually a lot of protests, and there was pro-Christmas rioting that broke out. And in fact, the city of Canterbury was controlled for several weeks by pro-Christmas rioters who decorated doorways and hallways, and decorated the buildings and so on, and sung Christmas songs. Now they were also, there was reports of them shouting lots of royalist slogans. So it seems that the desire to celebrate Christmas was mixed together with just opposition to parliamentarianism in general. So I don't think it was just that these people were such avid Christmas fans that they felt that they had to seize a whole city. There was more to it than that. But nevertheless, I do think it's quite interesting.
It is really interesting, and again, we keep touching on things that we really can't dive into too much. But here in America, of course, there's the idea of the Puritans leaving the old world, just searching for religious freedom, and not so much discussion of why.
Yeah, exactly. It actually, funny enough, when I first learnt about these, these protests and then these rioters, pro-Christmas rioters taking over a whole city, which I think is a hilarious thing when you say it, right? I actually remembered, or it sort of made me think about last year, of course, during the pandemic, there were lockdowns during the festive period. And there was a big discussion about whether or not, Christmas would be sort of quote unquote cancelled. And in fact, the government decided not to enforce the lockdown during the 3 days around Christmas, right? I think it was 3 or 4 days. They basically, rolled back the regulations and allowed people to legally celebrate Christmas. And I did wonder if maybe they had, a lot of these people are in Parliament. Many of them, I know, for example, Boris Johnson certainly is a big sort of fan of history, right? He seems to read a lot of history books. He's written history books. I wonder if these people in Parliament who know their history were perhaps had in mind, the pro-Christmas riots and the seizing of Canterbury that took place when Christmas was banned in the 1600s.
I'm planning my own riot right now, for Christmas riot taking over a city.
Yeah, putting up trees and decorations. But of course, it didn't last that long, because there was the restoration of the monarchy in 1660, and basically all laws that were passed by the previous parliament were like null and void. They weren't recognized and they were repealed. And as such, Christmas was again celebrated in public. However, Christmas didn't really ever recover. It didn't seem to ever get back to that sort of pre-Puritan era level of kind of, debauchery. Oh, by the way, we didn't actually touch on why the Puritans wanted to ban it. So yeah, just, you may not know, or the listener may not know, of course, that it's partly to do with Puritan belief in, the idea of sola scriptura, that only what is in the Bible should be taken as a guide for living and your, the foundation of your belief in your way of worship. And of course, the celebration of Christmas isn't mentioned anywhere in the Bible. And as such, it was considered kind of unbiblical and a bit too Roman Catholic. At least that's what they thought. But more than that, as we mentioned earlier, this was really a time of like gluttony, excessive drinking, somewhat what some might consider immoral games, such as, pushing your head, up a woman's skirt and stuff. And this, obviously, as you can imagine, these are things that Puritans, they're not big fans of, right? The Puritans are not very famous for being big party animals. And as such, I think even more so than the fact that Christmas wasn't really biblical, it was the fact that they saw it as this time of just drunkenness and gluttony, and really didn't think that it belonged in a pious society.
I can see the point of view.
Yeah, I mean, each to their own. I mean, well, the way I look at it, if you think that Christmas is, unpious and, and you don't like it, well, fine, you don't celebrate it. But if others want to engage in their drunken debauchery, well, that's their business, as long as they don't bother anybody else, right?
Absolutely. But of course, that wasn't the time, was it?
No, it was a bit different then. And the thing is, of course, I think sometimes it's easy to forget that the end of the English Civil War and the restoration of the monarchy, it wasn't suddenly the end of puritanical belief, or it wasn't the end of it didn't suddenly resolve the high church low church divide and so on and so forth. But it wasn't as if the monarchy was restored and suddenly the whole country were high church Anglicans. Puritanism still remained an extremely powerful force culturally and politically. And as such, although, the celebration of Christmas became legal again, it was in still many communities, it would have been frowned upon, right? And the Puritans and people with Puritan leaning beliefs would have still held positions of power, right? Within the church, not just within society, but within the church, provided, of course, they conformed to the main sort of doctrines of the Anglican faith. But nevertheless, there would have been churches in villages and stuff which would have had very sort of Puritan leaning vicars, right, who wouldn't have been condoning, Christmas celebrations, at least not in the sort of pre-Civil War era style, right? And in Scotland, in fact, Christmas didn't become a public holiday until 1958. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that Christmas wasn't celebrated in Scotland, but I think it does sort of speak to the continued influence of those kinds of opinions, because for your listeners who don't know, in Scotland, the established church, or while it's no longer established, but what was the established church, the Church of Scotland, it's a Presbyterian church. It has a Calvinist, it's based on, its beliefs are based on Calvinist theology, and it's generally, to oversimplify, on the spectrum, it's more low church, generally speaking, than what the Church of England is. And as a result, those kind of more Puritan beliefs had perhaps greater force in Scotland. And I think that's why we see the sort of, we don't see as much of a return to Christmas celebrations in Scotland. And I think as well, it may even explain why Hogmanay is such an important celebration in Scotland. So Hogmanay is the Scottish New Year's Eve celebration. And still to this day, for many Scots, Hogmanay is as important as, so New Year's Eve is as important as Christmas is. And I think perhaps one of the reasons for that was because in the absence of a Christmas celebration, they still wanted to have a sort of midwinter celebration. And so it went towards this secular Hogmanay festival. And I mean, we see a similar thing happened, of course, in the former Soviet countries, right? Where because there was such a long period where they weren't allowed to celebrate Christmas, the way that New Year's Eve is celebrated in those countries has taken on many of the customs that were previously associated with Christmas, right? So it wasn't as if just suddenly, okay, the Civil War's over, we can go back to celebrating Christmas. No, in fact, there was quite a steady decline, really, from the sort of Civil War and then onwards.
Yeah, that's one of the interesting things. I mean, with the Civil War, I think I've touched on this elsewhere. With the Civil War, whether you win or lose, you have to live with the other side afterwards, and you still continue to influence each other. So yeah, these debates carry on. Exactly.
It doesn't just suddenly end because one side is victorious, because it's a civil war. These people are, they live next door to you in many cases, right? And some sort of settlement has to be reached. So that really, it seems like Christmas actually declined in popularity until the Victorian period, and it's from the Victorian period that what we sort of know and what we think of as Christmas today, the way that it's celebrated, our ideas about what Christmas means, it was really developed in that era. And much of how Christmas was celebrated in Victorian England would be very recognizable to, people living in the US, Australia, the UK, elsewhere in the Western world in 2021.
Absolutely. So which of the traditions would you say are kind of rarely come from the Victorian era?
Many of the traditions that are popular today originate from that time, but I actually think that more interesting than the individual traditions is what we think Christmas means. Because as I mentioned previously, Christmas was on the one hand this religious celebration, right? Celebrating the birth of Jesus. On the other hand, it was an excuse to get absolutely smashed and engage in all sorts of, debauchery, for want of a better word, right? And that's certainly not what we think of as Christmas today. We still, of course, see Christmas as having its religious element, but I think if you ask people today, what is Christmas about? The most common answer will be, it's about goodwill, it's about charity, it's about spending time with your family, right? And that really developed, that idea of Christmas is really a Victorian idea. If you could go back in time and ask an Elizabethan, I don't think that's what they would say to you. They would either say it's about the birth of Jesus, or, for some people they would say, oh, it's about having a few days off and eating and drinking, heavily, right?
Yeah.
And no, it's not entirely clear how this transition happened. I think that, we spoke before about the importance of the Victorian era, right? There's just so much radical cultural and political and economic change going on at that time that with so many different things happening, it's almost inevitable that, new ideas and things will spring to life, right? And I think it may have partly been influenced by Queen Victoria herself. Queen Victoria was the first monarch really to put herself in the public eye, and really cultivate her public image in a way that other monarchs hadn't done in the past. And of course, technology allowed her to do that in a way that it hadn't been in the past. And her public image was one of, besides being this great, powerful woman, she was a loving mother of 9 children, right? And a happily married, committed wife. And she really presented this idea of sort of an idealized family. And the royal family, were looked up to as this like family that you would want to be like, and they really embodied these kind of family values and put family at the center of life. And it's hard today to really sort of understand how influential the royal family could be, how much kind of trendsetters they were. I mean, they were, it's like all of the most important celebrities combined into one, right? So really when the Queen and the royal family did things and acted in a certain way, that would be copied by the aristocracy and then the emerging middle classes, and then eventually down to working class people and agrarian workers, right? So I think partly it was Queen Victoria herself, embodying this idea of family and wanting family to be at the sort of center of everybody's life. And then also as well, the Victorian era saw the huge rise in charitable giving, right? Many charitable organizations were created in that era. Prior to that, charity existed, but nothing like on the sort of institutionalized scale that it existed in the Victorian era. And philanthropy boomed, with many of the newly rich industrialists, setting up philanthropic endeavors to help people and so on. So we're talking of an environment where charity, goodwill, family values are, becoming more important, I think, and becoming part of the sort of popular culture. But I think if we had to put our finger on the sort of single biggest factor which changed the idea of what Christmas is or what Christmas could be, I think it has to be Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol, which was first published in 1843.
Yeah. So this is really about how life starts to imitate art.
Yeah, I think this is perhaps one of the greatest examples of life imitating art. I mean, the influence of that book, in fact, it's been so influential that many people don't really think about it anymore. I mean, that sort of shows you how influential it's been, right? That we take it for granted. No, look, let's be clear. It wasn't as if Charles Dickens just invented all of this idea about Christmas. He was a product of his times, right? He was reflecting what he was seeing happening in the culture anyway. So it's not as if he was just creating everything from scratch and he invented the idea of Christmas being this time for family and goodwill and charity. As I said, these were things that were already happening within the popular culture, but he really did put it together in this accessible way and make it fun and interesting and make the message pretty clear, right? That this is what Christmas should be about. And the book itself was hugely popular. It's incredibly popular, well-selling book. And although he was reflecting what was going on in society, he did actually, maybe create is not the exact right word, but he certainly popularized things which may have never been popularized without him. So even things like, for example, the greeting Merry Christmas. Now, it existed prior to Dickens, but it was very rarely used. There are a few recorded instances of it. And then, of course, following his book, that's the way that the whole world in English greets each other at Christmas time, right?
Yeah, and to the point that you hear somebody say Happy Christmas and you think, surely it's merry.
Yeah, it sounds weird. Yeah, of course. So I really think that, that's a fantastic example of life imitating art, with, Dickens giving us that kind of, in this nice, easy, short, fun way, this sort of, what would you call it? Ready-made idea of Christmas, right?
Yeah.
It's about putting your bad feelings and stuff behind you. It's about thinking about others and being charitable and spreading goodwill. And it's about spending time with your family. And that's, he put that all together in an easy to digest, piece of art. And then, it just exploded. And it's from that time and the influence of that book, which gives us this sort of modern idea of Christmas. And in fact, that's where I'm going to stop the history of Christmas in the British Isles. Now, I could go on. There's obviously been developments since, but I don't think it's worthwhile dwelling on it too much because, firstly, most of the viewers know about the history of Christmas in the 20th century, more or less, right? I mean, the general trends. And also just because, really, compared to, say, the changes that happened from the Elizabethan period to the Victorian period, the changes from the Victorian period to today are relatively little. Like I said, the way that, we celebrate Christmas today, of course, except for the technological changes, are not particularly dissimilar to the way that it would have been celebrated in the late Victorian era. So, I think that's sort of a good place to stop because that's really where we get to the point at which Christmas is what we know it to be today.
Absolutely. And that change from what you described as the Tudor Christmas to the Victorian Christmas, that's night and day.
Yeah, exactly. It's radical, right?
Yeah,
it's minor changes. I mean, we're talking about things like sort of, the creation of some new traditions like, watching Christmas films, for example, or Christmas pop music. But it's not the huge radical change. We certainly haven't changed what we think Christmas means, right? The meaning of Christmas is, I think, absolutely the same as it is, in A Christmas Carol and today, right?
I agree. And it's funny that if you ask me about A Christmas Carol, I might have to think who wrote it, because it's one of those stories that's gotten away from the author. Is it the Muppets version? Is it the Michael Caine? Or is it there's Disney versions, there's cartoon version? It's one that's really exploded and
I mean
that's kind of elsewhere.
Well, that's the mark of a great story, right? Is it becomes, well, it either is archetypical or perhaps in some ways becomes archetypical, so that Christmas Carol is kind of the archetypical Christmas story because it's the story of the person who's unhappy, doesn't like things, is bitter, mean to other people, and then he realizes the error of his ways and he changes. I mean, that's the thing that I remember actually talking to my students in China about Christmas films. We do a class on Christmas films, and I try to explain to them that every Christmas film is essentially the same, right? Now, that's not to degrade Christmas films. I love Christmas films. But every Christmas film is essentially the same. The story is the same, right? It's a story about somebody who, for some reason, doesn't understand the real meaning of Christmas. They think it's something else. They think it's about the presents. They think it's about whatever, right? And then something happens. So the middle part of the film is something happens, and then they learn the real meaning of Christmas at the end, and they change their ways, right? So Home Alone, of course, Home Alone, Kevin hates his family, thinks he doesn't want to be with his family. His family get taken away from him. He realizes the importance of family. At the end, he's reunited with his family, and they have this great family Christmas, right? Every other Christmas film is the same. It's the same story, right? Just told. And that's essentially that's the story that Dickens wrote, isn't it?
Yes, absolutely. That's a good story. I'm happy to watch it again.
Yes, it's a great story. So I thought what we could do now is we could look at some of the famous customs and traditions that we all enjoy at during the Christmas period that have their origins in British culture. So things that you are extremely common across the world, right? So things whether you are in the UK, Australia, China, Spain, you likely do some of these things, but they have their origins in what we today call the UK.
Okay.
First one I thought we should start with, perhaps the most widespread maybe Christmas practice, which is the giving of Christmas cards, which again is something that's so ubiquitous now. I think most people don't realize there was a time when people didn't give Christmas cards, right? And certainly a lot of people probably have no idea that there was, an originator of this, right? And that it started in one place, because we just think about it now like eating or drinking. At Christmas, you give Christmas cards.
Yeah.
The first ever, well, it's often said that the first known Christmas card to be sent was given by the German alchemist Michael Meyer, I'm not really sure how you'd pronounce the second name, to King James I during Christmas in 1611. And again, if you sort of Google first Christmas card, that's the answer you'll get. I've done some research into this Christmas card. Now, I'm not able to see a picture of it. It's held in some library in Scotland, and for some sort of weird copyright reason, which I don't really understand, because I would have thought it would be out of copyright by now. But anyway, for some weird copyright reason, I can't seem to find a photo of it. But what I have seen is I've seen a recreation of it. So somebody has drawn and written a recreation of it. And to be honest, it's not a Christmas card. It's a letter with a Christmas greeting on it. And there is some drawings, but the drawings are like alchemical symbols. They're Rosicrucian imagery. So to say it's a Christmas card, I think I know you can get into the no true Scotsman argument, of course, what is a Christmas card? But I think if I wrote a letter to you, right, and I wrote like Merry Christmas on it, and I drew a picture of a scarab, which is a Rosicrucian image, right? I drew a picture of a scarab, and then you received that letter. You wouldn't say to your wife, "Oh, Caine sent me a Christmas card," right? You'd say, "Oh, I've got a letter from Caine."
With a picture of a scarab on it.
With a picture of a scarab on it, yeah, exactly. So I think to say that's the first Christmas card, I don't think that's fair. So I personally am of the opinion that no, King James I didn't receive a Christmas card. He received a letter, which happened to say Merry Christmas, which in my eyes is not the same thing. But I suppose
the nub of why they're not releasing pictures of this.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. But I mean, whatever. If you want to say that's a Christmas card, I suppose it's semantics. What we can say, though, is that what I would consider the first real Christmas cards were commissioned by Sir Henry Cole, who is a pretty interesting guy himself, actually. He was a civil servant and an inventor, and he commissioned these cards in 1843. And you can see them online if you just Google image search Henry Cole Christmas card. And it's an image of a family, a sort of extended family, like grandparents, parents, kids, all holding glasses of wine. And in front of them, it says, "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to you." And those were the first ever Christmas cards, real ones, not including the letter.
That sounds to me like a recognizable Christmas card.
Exactly right. And these Christmas cards, and these were the first, but many more were made. And these Christmas cards, they were actually more like postcards. So they weren't the folding cards that we're familiar today with. They were just not one-sided, but you know what I mean, like a postcard, right? You don't fold it and bend it in half. And what I think is interesting is that in all of my time in China, all of the Christmas cards that I've been given have actually been postcards. Now, you can certainly get folding Christmas cards because I've bought them myself in the past and given them to people. So you can absolutely get them. But generally, if you walk into sort of there's often these little stationery shops or sometimes like arts and craft shops that you'll find in China just scattered around. And it's in those shops that you can often find Christmas cards. And they're, in my experience at least, almost always postcards. And the ones I've been given are postcards. And I always thought that was weird when I first arrived in China, that I was being given postcards as a Christmas card, because of course it doesn't match my experience. So I find it actually interesting that the original Christmas cards were postcards. So in a sense, this sort of Chinese modern tradition is more, in a way, quote unquote, authentic than the modern English tradition.
Makes sense. They're more traditional than we are.
I suppose so, yeah.
Yeah. For me, I used to actually travel to Hong Kong to get the foldy Christmas cards.
Really?
And I'd give them out to my Chinese office, and for them it was the first time they'd ever received anything like that. So
yeah, well, even birthday cards. I've had birthday cards in China which have been postcards as well. I just don't think the foldy cards are very popular in China. I mean, card giving is not popular generally anyway. Card giving is seen very much as a Western thing, and I just, for whatever reason, I guess, don't know, they don't like the foldy cards. Yeah. It seems that the this sort of invention of Christmas cards was facilitated by the creation of the uniform penny post, which happened in 1840. And what that basically meant was that for 1 penny, you could send any sort of small letter or card anywhere in the UK. And as a result, this was not exactly revolutionary, but you've got to think that this was a time when most post had been done privately, right? And it could be quite expensive, so what you're saying now is that this is no telephones, no internet. You can now talk to people and share messages with your friends in different cities for an extremely affordable price. That sort of anyone really could afford that kind of money, at least to send a few cards. So yeah, the penny post not only facilitated the sort of invention of giving Christmas cards, really much of the card giving tradition that we think of today originated in that time, with this sudden ability to be able to send cards to people. You saw this explosion of birthday cards, Valentine's Day cards, all sorts of cards. The giving of cards really became popular then. The interesting thing as well, I think anyway, about Christmas cards in the Victorian era is they generally don't have Christmas theme. So we usually think of a Christmas card today, right? And it's either a sort of a picture of a snowy landscape in Northern Europe, or a snowman, or it's religious iconography, right? It's the baby Jesus and so on and so forth. Whereas if you actually go and look at the pictures of the cards from that period, and again, you can just Google image search, Victorian Christmas card, what you'll see is that a lot of cards have what you might call just sort of generic nice images. So flowers, pictures of fairies, various animals. But then what's really interesting is there are these very, very strange images which certainly have nothing to do with Christmas, and they don't seem particularly nice. So for example, there's a card, again, you can find these very easily just by Google image search. There's a card I remember of a stag beetle playing with a frog. That's one. These are obviously hand-drawn images, right? A dead bird, which, I don't know, dead birds, does that say Christmas to you?
No, Christmas.
Yeah, there's one that I like of a rat riding a lobster. So he's riding the lobster like it's a horse, but he's a rat.
These up, and I'm going to be putting these on my Instagram and seeing what people think of these as Christmas cards.
And then there's one of, I remember one I saw of children riding bats. So I'm not sure how these things came to be, but they're more interesting, I think, than modern Christmas cards. If you want to give a really unique Christmas card that somebody's going to remember, maybe just go and print off a load of Victorian Christmas cards on card, and then do them yourself. And yeah, if they've got a sense of humor, I'm sure they'll like it.
Just imagining someone opening. Another person sent me one with a stag beetle. What's going on this year?
Yeah,
we'll all be listening to the same podcast.
Exactly. So yeah, Christmas cards, wherever you are in the world, the next time you give a Christmas card to somebody, perhaps remember that that's actually a tradition that began in the UK. And another tradition which is popular, now this is not really popular across the world, it's certainly popular in the Anglosphere. I don't know how popular it is in continental Europe. Perhaps if you've got any listeners listening in continental Europe, or people who are from continental Europe, you could tell us. But caroling, which is, for those who don't know, perhaps means going door to door and singing carols, singing these Christmas songs, right? That's something which, again, originated in the British Isles. Now, that's not to say that Christmas songs originated in the British Isles. The first known hymns that have Christmas themes actually date back to the 4th century in Rome. But the act of going door to door and caroling seems to have been an invention. Invention's the wrong word, but seems to have developed in the British Isles. And the first appearance of Christmas carols in English, the first written appearance anyway, they've I'm sure predate this by hundreds of years, was in 1426. There's a work by a chaplain from Shropshire called John Audley, and it's a collection of 25 carols for Christmas. And if you think that was in 1426, right, and he's written down 25 carols for Christmas, so it's almost certain that there would have been many more than 25, right? There could have perhaps been, he's just one chaplain in Shropshire, and this is a time long before the post service and the internet and so on. And yeah, he's writing them down, but they're probably many hundreds of years older than that, but that haven't been written down previously.
That is really, really interesting. I think, I sing for the church choir.
Yeah.
Something that really interests me about the history of these things is that we often have the written lyrics, and we often have like a modern day tune that we all accept and expect. But often before the invention of standardized written music, then you'd have all kinds of local tunes. And even today, as you travel around different cathedrals and so on, you often do have like a localized version of the different tunes.
Yeah, and for some of them as well. Certainly, yeah, with the tunes, because many of the tunes actually came much later, right? The tunes usually came; these were often sung just with a cappella, right? Yeah. And the tunes came much later, and like you said, there was a lot of variation in different places. But also in some of the instances, there are different variations on the lyrics, right? The lyrics haven't been fully established until more recently. So interesting as well, because you're saying that, singing in the choir. So you, of course, have sung many carols in church. Carols actually originated as folk songs that were sung as celebrations at celebrations outside of church, and it wasn't until quite a lot later that they began to be sung in churches. You know, in church there was sort of the official, quote unquote, official hymns that would be sung, and caroling was it was a folk practice. It wasn't something that really belonged in church, you know.
Yeah, and I remember, I mean, I'm on the edge of my ignorance here and the edge of my memory, but I believe when introducing them, there was actually quite a big debate over that. I mean, considering that one Christmas carol is it about Christmas or is it about figgy pudding?
Yeah.
Should that be in a church, you know?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm sure this would have, again, it wouldn't have happened at one point, right, with one group of people. We would have been talking about a period of time and some churches being more accepting and some churches being less accepting. But I think it is interesting because today, you know, if you want to go and see a carol service, you're going to a church, basically, right? Yeah. Or who is it who we usually think of as singing carols on the street? Well, it's the Salvation Army, who are, of course, a Christian group. But actually, it's not to say that these songs weren't Christian in their themes or that they weren't sung by Christians. Of course they were, but they weren't church songs. It wasn't until much later that they were sung in church, and then many famous carols were written by churchmen. You know, originally these were folk songs. They would have been created by illiterate people, and they were sung outside of the church, you know, just at sort of gatherings and parties and so on. So the practice of caroling itself, not just the carols, but going door to door and singing, developed or appears to have developed from a much older tradition known as wassailing or wassailing, depending on how you say it. Now, with wassailing, there's two traditions, and both of them are called wassailing. However, they seem to be totally unrelated. So it's important to not get the two confused. So one thing which is called wassailing is actually an incredibly ancient pre-Christian tradition, which involves it's also quite unique to the cider growing regions of England. So for the American listeners, again, when we say cider in British English, we mean what you call hard cider, so an alcoholic drink fermented apples making an alcoholic drink, right? When Americans say cider, they mean a non-alcoholic drink, don't they?
Yes, because I came across this very recently as was being offered cider at a time of day I didn't want to drink,
right? Yeah.
And I was being quite confused by this conversation. So for British listeners, yeah, their cider has no alcohol.
Yeah, and they have hard cider, which is what has alcohol. But what is cider without alcohol then? Because it's not apple juice, is it? Because apple juice would just be called apple juice. So what is cider without alcohol?
It's the sparkling apple juice that you get in Germany.
Okay, so just sparkling apple juice.
As far as I can make out, yeah.
Which is interesting because cider, as in what we call cider, isn't sparkling for the most part, like traditional cider, you know? Yeah. Anyway, again, another story.
Funny, isn't it?
So yeah, in the cider growing regions of England, which is basically the West Country, so Somerset, places like that, also outside of the West Country, Herefordshire. So in these cider growing regions, in the sort of middle of winter kind of time, people would go into the orchards and they would make lots of noise and they would sing and they would recite certain incantations to the trees. And they would also drink to the trees in the way that you sort of drink to a person's health. They would drink to the trees. And this was done to awaken the trees from their winter sleep, to scare away evil spirits, and to help ensure a good harvest. And in fact, there are still some villages and towns in the southwest where they still perform this tradition. And you can go and join in. They often include Morris dancing as well, which again is a very ancient practice, which perhaps we can talk about in a different podcast. And that's known as wassailing, right? That tradition is called wassailing. But that is entirely separate, as far as I can tell, from the wassailing that developed into caroling. The wassailing that developed into caroling was when peasant farmers would go to their landlords at Christmas time, usually on the 12th night, although it also happened at Christmas Eve and perhaps also throughout that 12 days of Christmas. And they would sing songs, usually carols, you know, songs about Christmas and so on, in exchange for food and drink to have at their, you know, at their feasts themselves.
We won't go until we've got some.
Yeah, that song is related to wassailing, right? It kind of explains what's going on. They're going to a richer person's house and asking for food. That's essentially what it is. I think the reason that we have these two separate things called wassailing is because the word wassail comes from a Middle English word, which is wes hale, which means to be healthy or be healthy. So I think it's a bit like, when you drink and you say to your health. I think that it's the same. You're saying to your health to the trees, and you're saying to your health to the person who you're singing to. So I think it's just the fact that the word has a meaning of like, I don't know, you're greeting somebody, you're wishing them well, right? So it's been used to describe two very separate things. You
That's
understand what I mean?
really, really interesting. And again, just kind of the nature of traditions in the UK. So I've spent more of my time in the north. I haven't lived in the southwest. So I've actually never come across this west sailing to the trees.
Oh well,
I think that's
I've never partaken in it, and I actually grew up quite close to one of the UK's main cider growing regions, which is Herefordshire, and cider was an extremely popular drink in that part of the country. But yeah, I can't say I've ever seen it before. But then again, we're talking about very old traditions here. I said some villages still do it. It's not
sure.
widespread, right? I mean, if we'd gone back
No.
500 years ago, we would have probably seen it.
But it's now being
yeah.
added to my list of things. As I'm doing all this research on British culture, I keep getting more and more things that I'd love to see about my own country. I've never come across them,
Yeah, that would be a fun one, I think. We're sailing. It does sound fun.
Does.
So yeah, that tradition of going to, your landlord and asking them for some food, that seems to develop as the sort of social structure changed. And of course, the idea of peasant, the feudal system changed into the the sort of the mercantile and the capitalist system that followed. No longer did people go to their feudal landlords, but they would go to more wealthy people. When some of these people who were previously, agrarian workers moved into the cities, right, during the Industrial Revolution, they would then go to the richer people in town, and that's how caroling developed. And we see this as well at other times of the year in the UK, right? Penny for the Guy is another example of this tradition. At Halloween, trick or treat is a similar sort of thing. So I think we're talking about a time when a lot of people were very poor, and it was expected that more wealthy people would give to the poor, right? So, poorer people would go to more wealthy people's houses, and they would, ask them either, depending on what it might be, either for some money or for some food. So it was just sort of, it was the Christmas version of that, essentially.
I see. That is interesting. I'm kind of wondering if that leads us on to Boxing Day.
Yeah, well, that's one actually I didn't think about. But now that you say it, yeah, that's quite specific to the British Isles, isn't it? So Boxing Day, it's the day after Christmas, it's the 26th, and that again developed in the Victorian era, and it was basically because the servants would work on Christmas Day. They would have to make the food and serve the richer people. So Boxing Day would be the day off for the servants, and they were given a box, and inside the box there would be presents. It might be some money, it might be some food. Who knows? It would obviously vary from household to household. And that's why that day became known as Boxing Day, the day on which servants would get to rest and would get a package, right, of gifts.
I've got to add in quickly here that a friend of mine used to teach about British culture to international students in the UK. And he'd always ask them, why do you think Boxing Day is so called, and give them a list of options. And one of them, of course, is the right answer. But one of them was, it's a boxing match between the Prime Minister and the King historically. And it was amazing to see how popular that theory was.
That's brilliant. That would be great. I wish it was that. That would be much more interesting. But unfortunately, it's nothing to do with boxing.
It's Boris Johnson versus the Queen. My money's on the Queen.
Yeah, I think so. It's not really observed at all today, though, is it? Boxing Day. I mean, what did you used to do for Boxing Day? When I was a kid, that would be the day we would go to see extended family. So, I'd be with my immediate family on Christmas Day, and then on Boxing Day, we'd go to see uncles and cousins.
I'd say that Christmas Day has been very, very structured, and then Boxing Day is like the relaxed day. Most common.
Yeah, it's when you eat the leftovers and maybe watch some films on TV. It's sort of it's like a second Christmas Day, right? They do have it in other cultures. In Ireland, they celebrate obviously Ireland, historically a Catholic country. They celebrate it as St. Stephen's Day, and they have certain customs related to that which we don't have in the UK.
That's interesting. Yeah.
What's your favorite Christmas carol, Tom?
Oh, you know what? Going back to Yorkshire, studying in university, there's a great Yorkshire song called Ilkley Moor Bar Tat.
Yeah, you were saying.
And they often sing while shepherds wash their socks to that tune.
Right, okay.
So yeah, I would say it's standard words, but with that different tune. It's a wonderful local variation.
Is it while shepherds wash their socks? That sounds like something that you might change the words to when you're in school.
That
I
might
think
sound like it might be something else.
isn't it? Isn't it while shepherds watch their flock by
Oh,
night?
thank you very much. Yes.
Right, yeah. That reminds me of being in school, and you'd sing hymns, but you'd change the words to make them sound a bit more funny. Yeah, well, many famous Christmas carols were written by English people, by British people, although there were also many done by Americans as well. For example, the first Noel, that's an old Cornish song. It's often thought to be French because of the name Noel, but actually in older English dialects, Noel was used to mean Christmas as well, of course, as a kind of hangover from the language that the Normans brought over. Joy to the World, that's obviously a very famous one, which a lot of people like. That was written by an English minister, Isaac Watts. He wrote quite a lot of hymns, actually, Isaac Watts, and that was written in 1719.
That's interesting. I mean, if we go to modern day songs, then Slade's Christmas song, just so popular. So here
I
it is,
wish
Merry
it could be Christmas. Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, they're not really carols, though, are they? I suppose that's an interesting question. What's the difference between a carol and a Christmas song? I always imagine that a carol had to have sort of religious significance, but then the thing is, how do you what about carols like the Holly and the Ivy? That's still considered a carol, but it doesn't have religious significance.
Yeah, it seems to be that we know it when we see it, right? We all feel we know a carol when we hear it, and we feel we know a Christmas pop song when we hear it.
Yeah.
Perhaps because also the folk origin.
I suppose that might be it. Yeah, but anyway, that would that would take up another podcast, I suppose. So let's go on to our last sort of Christmas tradition, which you likely enjoy and partake in wherever you are in the world, which, well, this is a bit different. It doesn't exactly have its origins in the UK, but it was propagated to the world largely as a result of the spread of British culture, and that is Christmas trees. And of course, again, this is one of those ones that almost wherever you are in the world, at Christmas time, there's a Christmas tree. Even in China, we spoke about how Christmas isn't such a thing. Nevertheless, you'll see Christmas trees in shopping malls and so on. And this is one, again, that I think many people almost reflexively believe is pre-Christian, and it actually has its origins in ancient pagan practices. And, it was the pagan people of Europe had trees that they decorated, and that just got appropriated for a Christmas celebration. But again, I personally don't find the evidence to support that theory particularly compelling. I mean, it's absolutely true that the custom of bringing evergreen plants into your home at winter was practiced by ancient people across Europe. It's likely why we have the association of holly and ivy with winter, right? And we still use them for decorations today. That's likely a very, very ancient tradition. And it may have been something to do with the fact that, evergreens, they stay alive throughout winter, hence the name evergreen, right? So it's kind of that, very obvious symbol that things will get better, the daylight will return, and so on and so forth. And also, it's true that there's definitely evidence that for Germanic people, trees often held important places in their religious practices. There was types of tree worship. There's sacred trees in the religions of various Germanic people, including the Saxons, who of course came to England. But to say that there's any kind of direct link between those practices and Christmas trees, I just don't really think is correct. It's not just because there were these pagan traditions which involve trees, it doesn't mean that Christmas trees are related to them. You understand what I mean?
Yeah, I see.
Yeah, and I think that's one of those things where people almost reflexively just sort of jump to that conclusion, and because there's some truth in it, it's easy to believe, but again, I don't think it's really the whole picture. It seems that Christmas trees actually originated in the 16th century in Germany, and the earliest known depiction of a Christmas tree is from a sculpture which is dated from 1578. So that's pretty recent, right? 1578. It's certainly not the sort of, pre-Christian Indo-Europeans that we kind of imagine might have been.
Long after Germany was a Christian country.
Yeah, exactly. Again, we don't know entirely how they developed, and like I said, I imagine that those kind of ancient practices of bringing evergreen plants into your home at winter influenced the creation of Christmas trees. But to say that it was a
story, is it?
Exactly. And to say to sort of imagine that you could go back, say, 3,000 years and you'd find people, in Germany with Christmas trees in their home, I just don't think that's the case.
Yeah, I mean, that's just in the Flintstones, isn't it? Where it's...
Yeah. So the first known instance, though, of a Christmas tree in the British Isles, because remember, again, this was a German tradition, was actually when Queen Charlotte, who was born in Germany, and she was the wife of George III, she put up a Christmas tree and decorated it at a party for her children in the year 1800. And that's, I mean, look, there may have been other instances, but that's the first one we can say for sure. But it didn't seem to really catch on. I don't know, maybe Queen Charlotte didn't do it again, or just wasn't very popular, but it didn't really catch on until Prince Albert, who we mentioned earlier, of course, was Queen Victoria's husband. He's German, and he also seemed to enjoy Christmas as far as we can tell. And he brought Christmas trees into the royal home, and he, would put them up and decorate them every single year. And not just, I think, not just in his home for his immediate family, but sort of throughout the royal properties that he and his family would visit during the Christmas period. And as a result of this, of course, again, we spoke earlier about how much the ability that the royal family had to set trends, an ability that they just don't have anymore today. And, more so than the Kardashians do or anybody like that, right? They were really, really trendsetters. If the royal family did it, then it would very quickly spread to the aristocracy and then down the sort of social hierarchy. So, this practice of having Christmas trees that Prince Albert brought to the royal home quickly spread amongst the aristocracy and then again spread to the middle classes. It didn't catch on so quickly with the working classes. I mean, you've got to remember at this time it would have been quite expensive to buy Christmas trees. It's not like it is today, right? But they began to be placed in hospitals and in markets and these other public events, often in a sort of as a kind of act of charity. That's perhaps not the best way to describe it, but you understand what I mean. It was sort of giving to the public, right? And that really cemented then the Christmas tree as this kind of essential part of Christmas. And of course, today, worldwide, it's the symbol of Christmas, essentially, right? Like if you think of Christmas, it's a Christmas tree that you're thinking of.
Absolutely, yeah. And that's the imagery that you'd see, I say, even where I lived in China, you'd see Christmas trees all around. That's even in Turkey as well.
Yeah. Now, you might be wondering, hold on, you said you were going to talk to us about popular celebrations that have their origin in the UK. And although, okay, maybe Christmas trees became more popular after they entered the UK and then they were spread from the UK to other places. But nevertheless, that's a German tradition, right? Wow. Here's the reason why I decided to bring it up. There is a story, let's say a myth, because that's what it is. There's a story about Saint Boniface, who you may or may not have heard of. He was an 8th century missionary from Devon. Devon is in the southwest of England. And he was a key figure in the Anglo-Saxon mission to the Germanic people, to Christianize the Germanic people, right? He's actually sometimes called the apostle to the Germans. So he was a very, very important person in spreading Christianity to the Germanic people who were still on continental Europe, right? Not the ones who came over to England. Now, during one of his missions in Bavaria, it's said that around the time of the winter solstice, he came across a group of pagans worshipping an old oak tree. And he was obviously very angered by this act of idolatry. And he took an axe, don't know, maybe he just carries axes around with him. And he apparently cut down the tree, just like sliced it down nice and quickly. I suppose everybody just let him do it. And miraculously, in place of the oak tree that he cut down, an evergreen tree grew. And the pagans who watched this happen realized that this was, a miracle, and it's the evergreen tree was a representation of God's everlasting love. And so therefore these pagans, they converted, and then the following year they decorated the tree to sort of mark the occasion, and that was the invention of the Christmas tree. Now look, it's highly likely that not a single thing about that story is true, but if it were, what that would mean is a British person actually invented the Christmas tree in Germany, and then it was brought by Germans back to the UK. So we could say it was a British invention.
I'm sold.
Exactly, yeah. So if anybody asks you, that's the story of the Christmas tree and why it's British.
Boniface, look it up. I'm going.
Yeah, exactly. One more tradition as well that we could do, kissing under the mistletoe. Ooh. And this is a really interesting one because, again, this is a tradition that really sort of became a thing in the Victorian era. And I think if you ask people about Victorian Britons, they generally would tell you that they were very stuffy, very conservative. They don't strike you as the people who would have invented the tradition of kissing under the mistletoe, right? You might think that would have been invented by the Italians or the French or something. Certainly not the Victorian Britons, right?
Yes, yeah, I can see it.
Yeah, but no, it turns out it was. Again, mistletoe is one of those things that its significance is certainly ancient, and its place in winter celebrations definitely does predate Christianity. Mistletoe has been seen by the Celtic people, the pre-Christian Celts who inhabited the British Isles, as a fertility symbol. They believed that its berries resembled semen, interestingly enough. And so, yeah, we've always had this association with mistletoe, as a fertility symbol. It was used in pre-Christian celebrations during wintertime, but the actual act of kissing under the mistletoe, there is no evidence that took place prior to the late 1700s, so sort of the, just before the Victorian era and then throughout the Victorian era.
So it really is a Victorian invention.
Yeah, so sort of pre-Victorian, but is when we have the first references to it. So I suppose if we get the first ever references in the late 1700s. So if we get the first written references in the late 1700s, perhaps we can say it was a popular thing in the early 1700s. But it really does seem to be from the Victorian era onwards that it becomes popular amongst a lot of people. And I've actually got a poem here, which was published in the Times of London in 1787. And the poem reads, "The pendant mistletoe hung up to view reminds the youth the duty youth should do, while tittering maidens, to enhance their wishes, entice the men to smother them with kisses." And that's one of the first references to mistletoe being used to encourage people to kiss each other.
Wow, I've never heard that before.
Neither have I. I didn't come across it until doing some research into this subject. But yeah, that's one of the first ever written references. But like I said, it probably, if that's when it's written, then it almost certainly predates that by quite a bit. And this is one of those traditions, actually, one of the rare traditions, which began in the sort of lower section of society, social economic section. So it began amongst the working classes. It was apparently very popular with the servants. And it was when the middle classes and the aristocracy saw their servants partaking in this tradition, which I imagine at first probably would have been a bit shocking, or at least they would have looked down upon as being a bit crude, that the middle classes, the aristocracy then adopted the tradition from the working classes. So this is one of those few instances where it's kind of the reverse of what we usually see.
Yeah, that is interesting. At the beginning, when we were talking about how there may have been one or two that did start and go up that way, and it's very curious what it's gonna be.
Yeah, that's the one. But yeah, most of the others really do seem to be a sort of top-down occasion. I think probably if we went back to the 12th night celebrations, I imagine a lot of that was more of a bottom-up affair. But it seems that the tradition of Christmas that we know of today, created in the Victorian era. I mean, remember we said that it was Dickens, a literary person, really helped to propagate those ideas. So yeah, a lot of it seems to be sort of top-down. But this is one where it's the middle classes and the aristocracy copying the customs of the working classes.
That is really, really interesting. And again, the Victorian era being such an era of change and everyone debating what is the right thing, what should we be doing right now, because everything seems to be in a state of flux.
Yeah, I mean, it sometimes puts it into our current time into perspective, because I think it's very easy. I think every generation obviously goes through this where they think that the time they live in is sort of unique in the speed of change. And I think the time we live in is a time of great change, certainly, and more so than many other periods in time. But, you know, the Victorian era, even more so, I think. And many of the sort of debates and arguments that we're having today, certainly it wouldn't be the same debates and arguments that Victorians were having, but nevertheless, it would have been just as heated and just as confusing. And, you know, people would have seen their world completely change in the space of one generation, you know?
Yeah. Yeah.
So for the last thing, I thought we could finish off. We spoke about traditions now which are popular across the world and have their origins in the British Isles. So I thought finally we could end with some traditions which still today are pretty unique to the UK and don't really seem to have spread. I'm not saying there's no one else in the world, you know, that celebrates this, or other people that in places perhaps like Australia and Canada where these are celebrated somewhat, but generally speaking, these are couple of pretty unique things to the UK, which I think are interesting and I enjoy. So yeah, I thought we could talk about those. And the first one is the idea of Father Christmas. Now, I'm sure your listeners have heard this name before, and they probably think of it as just another name for Santa Claus. And to be clear, today in the UK, Santa Claus and Father Christmas, these two names are used interchangeably. They refer to the same character, right? If you hear 99.9% of people who say Father Christmas today mean the same thing as somebody saying Santa Claus. But that's a relatively recent occurrence. And historically, we are talking about two very different people, or well, characters is a better word. We're talking about two very different characters. So firstly, the modern Santa Claus is largely an American creation. So it's a mixing of two older traditions, one the Dutch tradition and one the British tradition, and they mixed together in New England when those two people, you know, came to that part of the US, and they created this sort of new tradition which takes a little off each, and then that was spread around the world via the globalization of American culture, in particular Christmas films, right, where the idea of Santa Claus is spread. So I thought first we could talk about the Dutch tradition, so we can contrast, because the Dutch character is much closer to the modern Santa Claus than the British character is. So I thought we could talk about that quickly first, so that we can contrast it with the British character. Also, the Dutch character is very similar to other continental European characters, right? Whereas the British character is quite different. So the Dutch character is called Sinterklaas, and so my Dutch pronunciation is not very good, obviously. Sinterklaas, right? And of course, you can already hear when I say that it sounds very similar to Santa Claus. Santa Claus is just the anglicized version, right? It's the anglicized pronunciation of Sinterklaas, and Sinterklaas itself means Saint Nicholas, which of course, again, we're all familiar with. Saint Nicholas was an historical person. However, Sinterklaas is not an historical person. He is a character, right? And Sinterklaas, the Sinterklaas tradition, I would encourage your listeners to read into it, because I'm only going to touch upon it briefly here, but it's very interesting. So the idea, the belief, or the myth is that Sinterklaas, he arrives in the Netherlands on a boat, not a reindeer, and he goes up the canals, as you would expect. And rather than coming from the North Pole, he comes from Spain, which again probably sounds quite unusual to a lot of people. And he does have a little helper, but his little helper or little helpers, they're not elves. It's a guy called Zwarte Piet. So Sinterklaas, he comes to the Netherlands. He comes on Sinterklaas Day, which is the 12th of December, and he has a list of all of the kids who have been good and all of the kids who've been bad. Again, this is all sounding very familiar, right? The kids that are good, he gives presents to, or rather Zwarte Piet gives presents to. Where it gets a little bit different from the modern tradition is the kids that are bad get put into a sack and taken back to Spain for a year as punishment. So a little bit harsher than the modern Santa Claus that we think of.
It's a new thing to threaten children with.
Yeah. So, and then after he's given all the presents and he's put kids into the bag to kidnap them or not kidnap them, and then he leaves and he goes back on his boat to Spain, where he remains for another year. And so there are many other traditions where there is a character called Saint Nicholas in whatever the local language is, and he also has a helper that punishes children. So one that maybe your listeners might have heard of, because there have been a few films made about this, is in Switzerland and the Alpine regions of Germany. Saint Nicholas, his helper is a guy called Krampus. Have you ever heard of that?
Oh, yeah.
So Krampus is like this big demon guy, right? And if you've been a bad child, then Krampus will take you. I'm not sure what Krampus does to punish you, but I mean, he's a pretty scary guy. So I suppose anything he does will not be nice.
Don't know whether I'll be sharing an image of him on my Instagram or not.
Yeah.
I like to share nice images.
So this idea of a man who judges children, who has a list, who rewards them if they are good, punishes them if they're bad, who comes from a different place, who has helpers, right? We can see all of those traditions in the modern Santa Claus. He comes from the North Pole. He has elves who are helpers. He has a list of kids who are naughty and nice, right? So that's where we get a lot of that modern idea of Santa Claus from. However, Sinterklaas is actually far from being a sort of fat, jolly man. He's dressed as a bishop because, he's St. Nicholas, right? So he's dressed as a bishop. He generally looks very stern. He's quite a serious guy. He keeps a list to judge children who are good and bad, right? It's really Zwarte Piet, my Dutch friends say, who's the sort of fun character, right? He's the one that kids like because he's the one that gives presents and he's nice and funny. Whereas Sinterklaas is really a very stern guy. He's a religious judge. That's the kind of guy he is, which of course doesn't match with our modern idea of Santa Claus. And that's where the British Father Christmas is the influence on the modern idea, right? So Father Christmas in the British Isles is somewhat different in the sense that he was never really a mythological being or character in the way that Sinterklaas was or Santa Claus is today. He was more like an allegory. He was a kind of personification of the idea of Christmas, right? Yeah. So the earliest mention of this kind of personification of Christmas actually comes from a Christmas carol, a 15th century Christmas carol. And in the carol, a character or a person or this personification is called Sir Christmas. And he announces the birth of Jesus, and he tells the audience to make good cheer and be right merry. And that's the first kind of instance we have in the British Isles of a personification of Christmas.
That's really interesting, seeing these different elements and how they come into play in our modern culture. Yeah, and
probably the first visual representation of Father Christmas actually comes from Ben Jonson's play in 1616, quite a famous play called Christmas, His Mask. Sometimes known as Christmas His Show or Christmas the Show, I think. I can't remember. But the official title was Christmas His Mask. And it was performed at court. It was a type of courtly kind of light-hearted play that was popular at the time. And in it, there's a character who's called Old Christmas. That's his name. So he's still not Father Christmas yet. He was Sir Christmas, then he was Old Christmas. And he's shown is wearing sort of old-fashioned clothes, and he has a long beard, so we're starting to get a bit more there, right? And interestingly, he scolds in the play. He scolds the guards for refusing to let him into the party, and he says, "As good a Protestant as any in my parish," when he's scolding the guards for not letting him in. And I think that's quite interesting, because think about when the play is being written and performed in 1616, right? So this is the period when we're starting to see Puritans attacking the idea of Christmas, and we have Old Christmas, this personification of Christmas, telling people that, no, I'm as good Protestant as anyone else, right? And because remember, of course, being a good Protestant here means in contrast to being Catholic. And of course, the Puritans often saw Christmas as being a Catholic thing, right?
That is interesting.
And the first illustrations, at least as far as I can find, of Father Christmas appear again in the 1800s. So it's really this sort of Victorian era, right? And we start to see drawings of Father Christmas. There were some that appeared in newspapers. Some appeared on Christmas cards, although that was quite a bit later. He's usually referred to as Father Christmas, but he's also referred to as Old Christmas. So again, his name's not fully established. And at this point, he's always shown as an old man. He's always got a beard. He's sometimes fat, although not always, which is interesting because Sinterklaas, the Dutch version, isn't fat. And very often the British Father Christmas is not fat. So I'm not sure why we insist on making him fat today. He's always shown as wearing a wreath on his head, like a wreath of holly, which I think is quite interesting. That sort of matches that idea of the sort of ancient practice of using evergreens for decoration, right? And when he is drawn in color, which is not very often, there aren't many color illustrations of him around from this period, he's wearing green rather than red. Now, interestingly, right, unlike Sinterklaas, there's no association of Father Christmas with children or gift giving. In fact, he was very much for the adults. If you look at the pictures, in almost every picture, in fact, every picture that I've seen of Father Christmas, he's holding wine. In many pictures, he's actually pouring wine. He's also got lots of food with him. And the idea was that he would sort of encourage merriment. He would encourage feasting and drinking. He would encourage people to be happy and to celebrate. So this is where we get that idea of the modern Santa Claus as being this jolly, merry guy who, likes to drink, likes to eat, he's fat. So what we have is from the Dutch Sinterklaas tradition, we have most of what we associate with the modern Santa Claus, right? But from the British tradition, we get the idea that this person is not a stern judge, but rather a guy who likes to eat, drink, and be merry and is jolly and is happy.
Which again gets back to what you're saying about the Elizabethan Christmas, really.
Yeah, I suppose it's a kind of hangover from that period, right? Is that, and of course today, I mean, Christmas is still certainly a period of gluttony, right? I mean, it's a period everybody eats and drinks far too much. So that's, although gone are the days where we're playing games like Hot Cockles, nevertheless, I think it's certainly a time that idea of eating and drinking and being merry has definitely continued.
I'm bringing it back.
Yeah, well, I think it would be cool to see some more representations of the traditional Father Christmas. I would like to see, I'm sure you can get them, I suppose, if you look online. But for example, some Christmas cards which show the traditional Father Christmas, I think would be quite nice. And maybe if you could see, when you go to like a shopping center, they'll sometimes have a Santa Claus or a Father Christmas. It would be quite cool if they had a sort of traditional British Father Christmas. So he was wearing green, he had a wreath on his head, he was drunk. that would be kind of fun, I think.
Fine.
Maybe not drunk. He's got to work with children, but he could. He's still a jolly kind of guy, right? And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about, which certainly I associate with Christmas, and I think a lot of British people do, although not everyone, but it's definitely a British Christmas custom, and I don't believe it's popular anywhere outside of the UK. And that's pantomimes, going to watch a pantomime. And what about you? Did you used to watch pantomimes when you were a kid? Did you go to that with your family?
Yeah, as a teenager, I was the pantomime drummer. I was leading the audience.
Well, there you go, right? So you associate it with Christmas, right?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. So pantomimes, for those who aren't familiar, they're a play. They're basically a family-friendly comedy play. That's the best way to describe it. They often also involve audience participation. It's very fun. Yeah, exactly. There's there'll be this sort of call and response where, for example, the famous one is the bad guy's running around and the hero can never see him, and he'll shout, "Where is he?" and the audience shout, "It's behind you."
Behind you.
Yeah, all that kind of stuff, right? Oh no, he isn't. Oh yes, he is. Yeah, all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, if you haven't been to a pantomime, I suppose it's a bit hard to describe. I once heard pantomimes very, very unsympathetically described as just bad plays. And I thought that's not fair. They're not just bad plays. Although some of them are a bit...
in terms of audience participation.
Oh, certainly, yeah. And I mean, a lot more fun than plenty. I've been to plenty of worse plays than I've been to pantomimes. I mean, pantomimes never fail to entertain, right? You can go to a play and it can be absolutely boring and rubbish. But a pantomime, you never come out of a pantomime having not smiled or laughed at least a bit, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, so pantomimes, they're, I was going to say almost always, I think always, I guess. They're always retellings of famous fairy tales and folk stories. So Sleeping Beauty, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Peter Pan, which of course isn't a fairy tale, but is a popular Well, is it a fairy tale? I mean, it's not an ancient fairy tale, of course. It was written relatively recently, right? Compared to, say, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Although, well, not Seven Dwarfs, but Snow White and the Dwarfs, right? Disney gave her seven. And these other,
Yeah,
famous
Jack and the Beanstalk and all
Jack and
kinds
the
of plays.
Beanstalk, Hansel and Gretel, all that kind of stuff, right? So these well-known, often very ancient folk tales. And yeah, as far as I know, pantomimes are really only popular in the UK. Again, I think there may be some pantomimes performed perhaps in some other English-speaking countries, but it's interesting that what is such a popular and important Christmas pastime in the UK really hasn't spread when so many other British customs have spread.
Yeah, I
Not
find that
really sure
strange.
why on
I'm
that.
thinking of all the things that could have spread. I'd have placed my money on pantomimes because they're so fun.
Exactly, yeah. And again, they pantomimes, obviously they're not unique. They are uniquely British, but they don't have a uniquely British origin. So there's a long tradition of folk plays in the British Isles. But to be honest, there's a long tradition of folk plays in pretty much every culture, right?
Mm.
The modern pantomime owes most of its developments to a type of Italian play called commedia dell'arte, which was an early form of comic theatre performed by professional actors that traveled from place to place. So they would perform these like comic plays. They were often heavily improvised. They featured harlequins, clowns, that kind of imagery, right? And these plays, they became popular in Italy. They were then later popular in France, and then they really started to become popular. They were adapted and became popular in England as well. But in the 1800s, those plays, those kinds of Italian style comedy plays, started to be supplemented by famous folk tales and fairy tales. And it seems sort of throughout the 1800s, the traditional plays with the harlequins and so on became less popular, and what were originally the supplementary folk tales and fairy tales became more popular until we get to the stage where the only thing being performed is the fairy tales and the folk tales, and so we have the modern British pantomime.
And I love them. I'm a huge fan.
Yeah, I think they're great. I'm not sure why they're so associated with Christmas. I mean, the panto season, they're often called pantos. When we talk about the panto season, it's actually a lot longer than Christmas, right? It's usually November till about sort of late January. Now, of course, that corresponds with the Christmas period. But I think many people really associate pantomimes with Christmas specifically, not just sort of winter generally,
Yeah. Even if I saw it in November, I think of it as a Christmassy thing.
Yeah, exactly. I think maybe it's just because you have more time off at Christmas. You want to do nice things with your family, so you go see a panto. But I would be interested to know from listeners elsewhere in the Anglosphere, do you have pantomimes? Or, are they things, maybe they're not popular, but can they be found? I would be interested to know. And you're right, it is surprising that they haven't spread, given as they would translate very easily even into other languages, right? Because there's a lot of slapstick humor involved. It's very visual. It's not like, say, Shakespeare, which, although of course Shakespeare has traveled extremely well, nevertheless there are difficulties translating the language and so on. Pantomimes can be understood by anyone, I think.
Yeah, and again, you have school plays and that kind of thing, which could easily be turned into a pantomime just with that element of audience participation, which is really what makes a pantomime a pantomime. There's lots of other traditions, but that's a key element, right?
Yeah, that's a good point, actually. What makes a pantomime a pantomime? I think audience participation. Well, I suppose as well, can you have a pantomime if it doesn't have a pantomime dame?
That's tough.
So a pantomime dame is, for the listeners who don't know, is just a man who plays a female role, but it's not any female role. It will usually be, for example, there might be men playing the two ugly sisters, right?
Yeah.
That would be a common one, or a fairy godmother. It's usually an older woman, not an attractive woman. And many famous pantomime dames have gone on to be famous actors, or vice versa. Famous actors have taken on roles of pantomime dames, right? And that's another thing. Many famous people, see, this is a bit mean, but many people who were famous and no longer can get on TV or films end up going to do pantomimes, right?
Yeah. And I should say that there's the pantomime boy, right? So girls will play the boy.
Yes, yeah, that's another thing, of course, that very often the hero will be played by a girl, right? So you might have Peter Pan, for example, played by a girl.
Yeah, exactly. I've heard some people kind of trying to throw this back again to the Roman era of, topsy-turvy festivals when, masters of servants and stuff like that. So there's an element of that. But perhaps, as I said earlier, it's an element, it's not the whole thing.
I'm not even sure if it's much of an element, to be honest, because again, I mean, the distance we're talking in time, and then place to get from ancient Rome to Victorian England, it just doesn't seem to me that would be the origin,
And it wasn't even a play in the ancient Rome, as far as I know. So
exactly. So I mean, maybe you could say in some sort of very abstract way the ideas, of course, because British people studied the classics, right? So I mean, some sort of abstract way that idea filtered in, but not in any direct way, I don't think.
Yeah, I think very loose inspiration.
So the last one I wanted to finish on, I imagine some listeners are wondering when we're going to get to the end. This is the last one I wanted to finish on, and this is a little bit different. This is not a tradition or custom which is popular around the world. It's a pretty uniquely British custom, but it's one that's no longer practiced today. And the reason that I want to talk about it is because I think it's a really great tradition, and I would like to see it brought back. So if the listeners would like to join me in kind of restoring this tradition, joining in this year and every year subsequently, I think that we can maybe start something, right? What started as an episode on your podcast could maybe in 100 years from now somebody else will do a podcast and talk about this being the date that people rediscovered this tradition. Who knows? And it's the tradition of reading ghost stories on Christmas Eve. Generally in the Christmas period, but specifically Christmas Eve. This was an extremely popular tradition in the Victorian times. It likely has its origins prior to the Victorian times, but I can't find out exactly how it developed or even why it developed. But we can say for certain that in the Victorian era, it was very, very popular. It was so popular, in fact, that in 1891, an anthology of Christmas ghost stories called Told After Supper was published. And in the introduction, the author writes, and I quote, "Nothing satisfies us on Christmas Eve but to hear each other tell authentic anecdotes about spectres." So the author of this book, now of course he's got a vested interest, it's his book that he's trying to promote. Nevertheless, he's saying it's so essential that people can't be satisfied on Christmas Eve unless they hear a ghost story, right? So this was a really popular thing. It's also worth remembering that A Christmas Carol is a ghost story, right? In fact, the full title of the book is A Christmas Carol in Prose, being a ghost story of Christmas. So, it's easy to forget that now, but this is a ghost story, and Dickens was obviously writing in a sort of a subgenre which was popular in his day. Many other people were writing ghost stories, and specifically Christmas ghost stories, and then they were reading it to each other, on Christmas Eve. And the tradition just seems to have died out. It did continue somewhat into the 20th century. I don't know if you know or if you ever saw, but there was a TV series that the BBC ran from 1971 to 1978, and it's called A Ghost Story for Christmas. And it takes many traditional ghost stories which would have been told at Christmas, and it adapts them for TV. Have you ever heard of that TV series before?
No, that's new to me.
I came across it years ago. And today you can actually find a lot of these on YouTube, by the way. So if you just search on YouTube BBC A Ghost Story for Christmas, you'll find a lot of the episodes. And honestly, they're done very well for a TV show from the 1970s. I think they're really well put together. And of course, they're classic ghost stories, right? So it's good. They've also got the people acting and reading in it, pretty competent actors, and these are great stories. And yeah, despite the fact it was the 70s and this is a state broadcast and not a Hollywood studio, I think they're made pretty well too.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, check.
To...
That would be, I suppose, my recommended rabbit hole if I can do one for this this podcast.
You're very, very welcome. I think I'm going to go on the rabbit hole for Boniface first, but after that,
right.
You're
And then
very welcome.
Ghost stories at Christmas. So I don't know why this tradition has died away. I also don't know why it became so popular. I mean, I don't think many people would think. You think of ghost stories, you think of Halloween, don't you? Right? You don't think of ghost stories at Christmas. But nevertheless, this used to be a really popular thing to do on Christmas Eve in particular, and generally throughout the Christmas period, would be to get together with your family and share ghost stories. And I think that sounds like a great tradition. Maybe I'm a bit biased as an English teacher. I obviously like reading stories. I like reading out loud. I like hearing stories. But nevertheless, I think the idea of sitting around on Christmas Eve with a fire, or if you don't have a fire, a video of a fire on your computer, and sharing ghost stories with each other. I think there'd be something really nice about that. It'd be great for families in particular to come together and put the phones and all the technology away, and do something kind of old fashioned. Yeah, I think that'd be really cool. So it's something I'm going to try and do this Christmas. I'm not sure quite how I'll go about it, but I'll try and do it. And yeah, I would encourage the listeners, if they're interested, to also try to kind of rediscover and revitalize that old British Christmas tradition.
That's a gripping tradition.
Are you gonna join me, Thomas?
I might do so, and I'd suggest the listener at home check whether the listener were dead all along.
Yeah. Okay. And that's really it. So I hope that's been informative. My history of Christmas, by the way, I of course left out lots and lots of things. So if you were listening and thinking, why didn't he speak about this? Why didn't he speak about that? By no means was I trying to present, a comprehensive view. I couldn't. I was just presenting what I would hope would be a sufficient overview of the development. And hopefully you've came across some things you didn't know about before, and you've perhaps got some jumping off points from which you could, do some research of your own. And yeah, that's about it really. It's time to get ready for Christmas and find some good ghost stories.
Fantastic. Thank you very, very much for joining me. And again, can you just say the name of the show that is your recommended rabbit hole?
Oh, well, so I suppose my recommended rabbit hole is Ghost Stories for Christmas. And as part of that recommended rabbit hole, if you just Google BBC, a ghost story for Christmas. In fact, perhaps Tom, in your notes, in the description of the podcast, along with the video I mentioned at the start of the show from Religion for Breakfast, you can perhaps also put a link to one of the YouTube videos for a ghost story for Christmas.
Absolutely. Consider it done. And like we say, those are good jumping off points.
Yeah.
There's been our deep dive into Christmas. Has it been a good one? Oh yes, it has.
Oh yes, it has. Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for having me on. Have a very Merry Christmas. I wish you and all your listeners a very enjoyable festive period.
Thank you.